The night before his speech, the world slept under the illusion that Africa would once again bow. News outlets whispered of an apology draft 12 pages long, signed by no one, but written by many hands that never touched African soil. They called it diplomacy, but he called it what it truly was: chains dressed in polite ink. In the dim light of his study, President Ibrahim Traoré stared at that paper, each line a demand to silence the voice of a continent, each sentence a dagger carved with centuries of arrogance. They wanted remorse, not reform; compliance, not courage. They had forgotten that Africa's silence was never consent. It was the gathering of a storm. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou trembled with restless anticipation. Old men sat under trees whispering, "He will not bow." Mothers prayed. Children dreamt of a tomorrow where Africa spoke for itself. And deep in the heart of the capital, Traoré made his decision, not to read their words, but to burn them. The smoke that rose from those pages that night was not paper. It was history being rewritten dot by morning. The whispers had turned into headlines. Traoré to address UN possible retraction expected. Washington smirked. Paris sighed in relief. Tel Aviv tightened its jaw. But in the villages of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, drums began to beat. This was not politics, it was prophecy. When his jet lifted off the tarmac bound for New York, it carried not a man, but a message 400 years in the making. Inside the cabin, aides rehearsed polite phrases. Traoré sat silently, eyes fixed on the clouds. He was not thinking of diplomacy. He was thinking of dignity. He was thinking of the millions who had died nameless in mines, plantations, and wars of profit. He was thinking of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah, the ghosts of revolution, whispering that freedom never comes signed in ink, but written in blood and courage. And so he closed his eyes and prepared not a speech, but a reckoning. When the plane touched down at JFK, the world expected silence. Instead, it met a roar. 200 members of the African diaspora stood outside, waving handmade signs. Africa doesn't apologize, and he speaks for us. Among them, a young woman ran beside the motorcade shouting, "Make them hear us, President." He rolled down his window, met her eyes, and smiled. In that moment, the speech became something larger than politics. It became a covenant between the living and the ancestors, between Africa and the world. The United Nations Chamber had seen empires rise and fall, but that day it would witness something rarer, the birth of a voice long silenced. The hall was full. Delegates from 190 nations sat beneath the great blue seal. Cameras blinked. Pens hovered. They expected contrition, perhaps deflection. They did not expect defiance. Traoré stood before the podium, the gold and marble reflecting the solemnity of a courtroom, and began with a calm that sliced sharper than anger. "I have been told to apologize," he said, his voice echoing. "Before I do, let me ask, how many times have you apologized for what you have done to Africa?" The silence that followed was not confusion, it was recognition. The kind of silence that falls when guilt can no longer hide behind protocol. He continued, "Did Belgium ever apologize for Congo? Did France ever apologize for Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for arming those who ravaged our continent?" A stir moved through the room like wind over dry grass. The cameras captured it, the twitch of discomfort, the quick glance of shame. Then, with deliberate grace, he pulled a phone from his pocket. Security guards shifted. "I want to read something," he said. A message from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou. "Mr. President, my teacher says you're going to America to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African." He paused. The chamber froze. A child's words, simple, raw, unfiltered, hung in the air, heavier than any diplomatic report. Then he looked up, his voice cutting through marble and ego alike. "That child has more dignity than this entire assembly." Some gasped. Some looked down. But no one could look away. "You want me to apologize," he said, "so I will. I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to speak without fear. I apologize that my predecessors were forced to choose between sovereignty and survival. I apologize that our children were taught to ask permission before they could dream. But I will not apologize for rejecting occupation disguised as partnership. I will not apologize for refusing humiliation wrapped in aid. And I will not apologize for being African and proud." The hall erupted not with applause, but with movement. The French delegate stood, face pale, and walked out. The Israeli representative whispered to his aide, "He's finished." The American ambassador folded his notes in frustration. But Traoré continued, every word carrying the weight of a continent long denying its dignity. "You speak of peace while dropping bombs. You speak of democracy while propping up dictators. You speak of aid while looting our minds. And when we finally rise to say no, you call it aggression." He leaned forward. "The age of submission is over. Africa will not kneel again." What happened next would change history. Within hours, the African Union called an emergency session at the Ethiopian mission in New York. 43 ambassadors gathered not to beg, but to declare. By midnight, they signed what became known as the New York Declaration, a collective vow that no African nation would ever again apologize for defending its sovereignty or accept conditional aid that demanded obedience. For the first time since colonial borders were drawn, Africa spoke in one voice. And that voice was not asking. It was asserting. Back in Ouagadougou, the streets erupted. Revolution Square became a sea of flags, drums, and tears. Grandmothers who had lived through coups and droughts danced barefoot. Youth chanted, "Isolation is independence." Farmers held up soil in their hands, shouting, "This is our wealth." The next morning, the European Union froze $27 million in development aid. The International Monetary Fund postponed debt relief. The French media called Traoré a dictator in disguise. But in Burkina Faso, the people only laughed. "If they freeze our money," one farmer said, "then they have freed our chains." In the days that followed, the tremor became a wave. From Nairobi to Accra, from Lagos to Dakar, people took to the streets, not to protest, but to proclaim. In universities, students debated sovereignty. In markets, traders refused goods tied to foreign exploitation. Musicians turned his words into anthems. Painters splashed walls with murals Traoré's face beside Sankara's. Beneath the words, "No apology given." In South Africa, lawyers filed petitions demanding sanctions on countries arming African conflicts. Across the Caribbean, from Haiti to Jamaica, leaders invoked the spirit of his speech, breaking ties with financial institutions that had long dictated their economies. A new language was being spoken, the language of dignity, of refusal, of freedom without permission. 6 months later, the world was forced to look again. Burkina Faso, long labeled aid-dependent, announced something unthinkable: total food security. No UN consultants, no Western advisors, only Burkinabe farmers using ancestral knowledge, rotating crops as their grandfathers had, reclaiming their land and feeding their people. Markets overflowed. Children learned not just arithmetic, but the story of how their hands had saved their nation. Grandmothers stood on national television, holding baskets of grain, saying, "We are no longer beggars. We are farmers again." It was not just survival, it was renaissance. From that point on, Africa no longer whispered. It roared. The UN speech was not just history, it was ignition. And as Traoré looked out from the palace balcony one evening, hearing the drums roll across the city, he smiled, not because victory had been won, but because fear had been broken. The West could freeze funds, cut ties, issue threats. But they could no longer command silence. The world had witnessed something that could not be undone, an African standing unbowed before empire and saying the one word it was never prepared to hear dash no dot, and that, brothers and sisters, was only the beginning.